my great pleasure to introduce Kajri Jain, who did her initial studies at the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad and followed that up with an MA and a PhD in art history and theory from the University of Sydney. She's currently, as you all know from our announcement, the Associate Professor of Indian Visual Culture and Contemporary Art at the University of Toronto. She's the author of a wonderful book called Gods in the Bazaar, The Economies of Indian Calendar Art, which was published by Duke University Press in 2007. Now, Kajri, as I suspect we'll see today, also has very broad interests, which I saw represented in her teaching at Toronto. She teaches courses not only on visual culture and colonialism, the contemporary art of South Asia, Bollywood in context, and art and intersubjectivity, but also on automotive affects. Did I say it right?
Yeah.
Automotive affects. On the recalcitrant...
Automotive.
Automotive, that's it. Automotive affects.
Or the visual culture of automobility. There's another iteration of that. Yeah.
And like these are courses I want to take. The recalcitrant icon and the aesthetics of democracy. And we can see in Kajri's teaching the reflection of her research interests. In her own words, she is, and I quote, interested in how the efficacies, affects, and values associated with images arise not only from what goes on within the picture frame, but also from the production, circulation, and deployments of images as material objects. And certainly these interests were at the core of Gods in the Bazaar. This is a fantastic book that I'm going to only quote one reviewer who wrote, and I quote, Kajri Jain presents the performatively linked worlds of the vernacular and the cosmopolitan to reveal how, quoting Kajri, modernity exceeds its own very powerful stories of itself, end quote. But this is now the reviewer again. They said, this is a book about calendar art and more. It exceeds itself. I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful thing to be said of any work. And these interests that I've mentioned seem to animate her current research on the emergence of gigantic, iconic statues in India after the neoliberal economic reforms of the 1990s. I personally am very much looking forward to her talk today entitled Minimum Government, Maximum Governance, Modi's Statue of Unity and the Sense of Scale. Please welcome Kajri Jain.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Farina, for that lovely introduction, and to the Center for South Asian Studies for the invitation, and also to Janelle Fosler for all her wonderful help in organizing the visit. Jessie, I'm going to be a finicky art historian. I'm wondering if we could take some light off the screen. I mean, it's not sort of fine art, but I do want you to be able to see the image without falling asleep. Is this going to be all right, or a bit soporific at this time of the afternoon? Okay, so this opportunity to talk to you comes at the perfect time for me because I'm just emerging from the term and getting my head back into a book manuscript that's awaiting revisions that, as Farina said, is something of a sequel to my first book, Gods in the Bazaar, and I think I'm going to call it, the second book, Gods in the Time of Democracy. So as Farina said, the first book was about the production and circulation of printed images, mostly but not only religious, from about the late 19th century to the late 20th. And this one is about the monumental iconic statues that have become an increasingly prominent feature of the religious and now the political landscape in India. I mean, they've pretty much gone viral from about the 1990s onwards. That is to say, in tandem with the economic reforms that brought India into the kind of global economy after decades of socialist-style protectionism. So essentially, both books use a particular form or genre to track the nexus between aesthetics, religion, politics, and what I call vernacular capitalism, but also in relation to broader flows of colonialism and, more recently, of what we've come to call neoliberal globalization. So, as you likely know, most of you, even as we speak, India has not one but two projects underway at different stages to build the tallest statues in the world, both about twice the size of the Statue of Liberty, which is 305 feet, including the pedestal. So currently, the tallest statue is the 420-foot Spring Temple Buddha in Henan, China, built from 1997 to 2008, so again, quite recent. Both the Indian statues are state projects and had their foundation stones laid by the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. The one for a 597-foot figure of Sardar Patel, who was India's first Home Minister and Deputy Prime Minister in 2013, when Modi was still Chief Minister of Gujarat, right, before he became Prime Minister. And in December last year, he laid the foundation stone for an even taller statue of Shivaji, who's a 17th century Maratha warrior king who was valorized as a kind of Hindu bastion against the Mughal invasion. And as you can see, he has this raised sword that gives him a few extra feet. Right? So he just pips Sardar Patel. So last month, the Maharashtra Coastal Zone Management Authority approved a height increase from 625 feet, or 190 meters, to 689 feet, or 210 meters, despite public interest litigation against the project on environmental grounds. Actually, what they did was they just changed the coastal zoning laws. While the Shivaji statue still awaits final approval from the Ministry of Environment and Forests, work is well underway on the Sardar Patel statue at an island near the highly controversial Sardar Sarovar mega dam in Gujarat, also, of course, named after Patel, which, as you may know, displaced at least 25,000 families of indigenous people. And in fact, the controversy was why the World Bank ultimately pulled out of the project, and it was finished by the Indian government. Ironically, one reason given for Indian public sector oil companies to be directed to channel their mandatory corporate social responsibility funds to the statue was that it would bring development to a tribal area. And so the stated target for completing the statue is 2018, next year. Although I don't quite think, I mean, it's not even a third built, I mean, the statue itself, so I'm not sure. Okay, so these Indian and Chinese statues, I mean, there's lots more apart from the one I showed you in China too. So they're clearly part of a global competition to assert their nation's presence as new centers of power. And this recalls, of course, the Statue of Liberty, initially intended to embody the new and old worlds, France and the US, in their kind of joint venture of global enlightenment, but was soon appropriated to symbolize the USA's replacement of Europe as the new center of freedom, democracy, and inclusion, the light of enlightenment morphing into a beacon of worldwide welcome in Emma Lazarus's 1883 fundraising poem, The New Colossus. But as Darcy Grigsby reminds us, Lady Liberty's ideological genesis was undercut by her formal entanglement with Enlightenment's others, given that her design was based on Bartholdi's proposal to the Khedive of Egypt for a monumental statue of an Egyptian peasant woman at the head of the Suez Canal. Note, an engineering feat like the Sardar Sarovar Dam. So the Sardar Patel statue's reference to the Statue of Liberty appears not just through comparisons of height, but of course in its name, the Statue of Unity. In this totalizing reconfiguration of liberty, I'll argue, it's not just to kind of exiles, migrants, or huddled masses that Modi's worldwide welcome extends, but to a specific feature of transnational capital in its articulation with governance and populist politics. So my aim here, and that of the book in general, is not simply to add to the mounting critiques of this waste of state resources that could be spent in far more effective ways to better the lot of ordinary Indians. Nor is it to reiterate a kind of pat connection between scale, power, phallocentrism, and so on, all of which is valid, of course. But it's really just a truism that doesn't address why this statue and this form emerges at this particular moment, right? So as an art historian, I want to try and think more historically about scale through the question of why the monumental statue form undergoes a resurgence in India in the 1990s, and its possible connections to how neoliberal imperatives unfold through what I think of as the infrastructures of the sensible. So, and I call this a resurgence because, of course, South Asia had earlier traditions of colossal rock-cut statues like the 2nd and 6th century CE Buddhas of the Swat Valley and Bamiyan, or the medieval Jain statues of Karnataka and Madhya Pradesh. But this form disappears for centuries until its recent reappearance, initially as Hindu, but also Jain and Buddhist iconic figures, mostly built in concrete. Usually, so it's the same technology as you'd use for a building, RCC, reinforced cement concrete, right? So they're usually freestanding, and anything from 15 or 30 to well over 100 feet tall. So it's not just big statue building by China, India's chief competitor, that paved the way for the Sardar Patel and Shivaji statues, but also these religious statues that now seem unexpectedly modest in comparison. It's the same sculptors, actually, who work for entrepreneurs seeking social status through this new, spectacular, non-canonical form of religious patronage, neo-spiritual leaders building expansive religious authority delinked from ancient oratic sites, and more recently, chief ministers of Indian states, like Modi, pandering to their vote banks, often via the discourse of tourism development, right? That's how you can build a religious statue, right, and call it development. So it was, in fact, to celebrate his 10th anniversary as Chief Minister of Gujarat that Mr. Modi announced the Statue of Unity project. And note that Sardar Patel was a Gujarati. When Modi became Prime Minister in 2014, this was converted, that is to say scaled up, to a national project with central government funding. But the project's importance at both levels, state and national, is mediated via its claim to globality, right, as a world's largest statue. So I want to use the Statue of Unity to think about the relationships between the big statue form, its scale, and a populism mediated via the global. By the global, I mean a protean realm of circulation, both actual and imagined, that is, as Bhaskar Sarkar puts it, multinodal and fluid, that is, plastic and malleable. Populism, too, speaks to a notion of a people that can be plastic and scalable in its glocal spatiality. So globality and populism are highly capacious and efficacious imaginaries, one spatial, the other identitarian. Scale comes in here as a mediating term whose salience at a certain moment enables a people to constitute itself via a certain idea of the global and the forces and processes that this idea generates. This salience, as I'll elaborate, inheres not just in the ontology of scale as relative size, but also in projects or processes of what Anna Singh calls scale making or scaling. And similarly, the idea of the popular gains its salience in projects of people making. So the affects of scale infuse identitarian ideas of peoples that are mapped onto territories at varying scales. And here, the language of number and quantity establishes comparisons or commensurabilities between different constituencies in the polity. These commensurabilities are instituted and gain force primarily via the statistical underpinnings of governmentality and its biopolitical operations, including electoral democracy, taxation, and of course, affirmative action or reservation policies in education and employment. Okay, all of that was really abstract, I know. So I'll make all of this more concrete shortly, but first let me quickly frame it within the other aspects of this genre's emergence alongside economic reforms. So in the book, I describe these statues as assemblages of several processes of varying durations and speeds, working in different registers that kind of converge in this form at this moment. So in terms of method, I'm working with a layered processual approach to art historical temporality that doesn't seek to account fully for a form's emergence only within its kind of period, right? So here, you know, there are things that happen beyond processes that start well before, you know, and converge at at different speeds. And so here, new forms don't replace old ones, but form complex circuits with them. So I'm really trying to get away from that kind of linear approach to temporality. So 6 of these converging processes in the big statue assemblage are, first, and this is a kind of central claim of my book, that it has a lot to do with democratic claims on the part of Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, and the force of publicness emanating from late colonial governmentality and religious and social reforms that brings icons out of temples that had excluded Dalits. Like, right, so, you know, what is the basis of kind of one of the bases of Brahminical authority is guarding the icon inside the temple. The fact that the icon comes out is kind of huge, right? So, and it's this, I contend, this kind of visibility that gives the statue form its political efficacy, right? The relationship to Dalit claims, and makes it part of the political vocabulary in the first place. And here, the DMK's Thiruvalluvar statue at Kanyakumari is key, along with Ambedkar statues, which actually come later. All right, so I mean, that's a whole piece, which I won't go into here. The second process is 20th century neo-spiritual movements and the centrality of state, scientific, and religious discourses of numbers and quantification as modes of legitimation, right? So in lieu of canonical oratic qualities, there's a valorization of quantity, size, and spectacle in temples, icons, and rituals. And I call this iconic exhibition value, which we can talk about later if you like. But I have to tell you, this art of living, they are probably in the, I mean, I don't think they're in the Guinness Book of Records for the number of world records, but they have like 15 Guinness World Records for, you know, like largest number of Bharatnatyam dancers on stage and, you know, largest number of bagpipers, biggest vegetarian buffet, etc. So
Not largest swan.
largest, no, this is not the largest one, I can assure you. But I can tell you who, anyway, we'll come back to that. Remind me. So in fact, some of the first recent big statues were built by the Chinmaya mission, whose leader also founded the global Hindu organization, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or VHP. And here he is, Swami Chinmayananda, with the mission's mantra of the maximum. Maximum happiness to maximum people for maximum time, right? And note, they have a spiritual mileage program. So you can accrue miles from, you know, the number of beads and so on. So this quantifying language also appears in the Modi government's mantra of minimum government, maximum governance, with which it came to power in 2014, which, as we'll see, pertains to the Statue of Unity in various ways. Then number 3 is the 20th century domestication of concrete as a medium, which we associate with industrial modernity, but whose eminently plastic and labor-intensive character means that it lends itself to vernacular forms, including icons, as we can see with this guy holding the bag of concrete there. And there's a connection. This complex, the statue complex, is part of what's known as the Birla Kanan, a garden that was instituted by the Birla family, who, among other things, I mean, they're a big industrial family in India. Among other things, they manufacture concrete, cement. So then number 4 is the post-liberalization rise of the Indian automobile industry. And that's why I teach those courses. As globalization's primary vehicle, as it were, and the visual and spatial regimes of speed that engender large spectacular forms that are visible from a distance, right? So think Las Vegas and roadside attractions, but in Hindu nationalist India. So this is what you get. And also, relatedly, 5, the way that automobility enables peri-urban and interurban development, right, along highways. So suddenly that land becomes valuable. And so this creates space on urban peripheries for religious parks, theme parks, and neo-spiritual complexes with such statues, which then enable further real estate development by sanctifying barren spaces and making them habitable, right? So part of what's happening at this moment is a major resignification and revaluation of land, often characterized as land grabbing, in which the statues play a role. I don't know why this picture is so small. I mean, it seems like the apartment complex is far more attractive than the world's tallest Shiva statue. But so clearly that's part of the appeal of this complex. Okay, so this relates to number 6, which is the process that I want to focus on here, which is the way that these statues embody status-building projects for their patrons in a specific regime of scaling. And here I'm following Anna Singh's analysis of what she calls the economy of appearances that's brought into play by globalized finance from the 1980s that entails not so much the actual achievement of profit, but a dramatization of capacity and possibility that deploys what she calls the self-conscious making of spectacle. This economy of appearances is accompanied by projects of scale making that conjure the globe via what Singh calls thick collaborations with national and regional projects. So as she puts it, in these times, and I'm quoting, "In these times of heightened attention to the space and scale of human undertakings, economic projects cannot limit themselves to conjuring at different scales. They must conjure the scales themselves. In this sense, a project that makes us imagine globality in order to see how it might succeed is one kind of scale-making project. Similarly, projects that make us imagine locality or the spaces of regions and nations in order to see their success are also scale-making projects." This is not really new to us when we're familiar with nationalism's scale-making project, and a lot has been said about the global and its interaction with cities, right? So the global city, but I'm not sure that we've paid enough attention to the institutional mechanisms that hitch the global to other scales to forge further thick collaborations. Among these mechanisms, I'd suggest, are the structural adjustment policies of lending agencies like the World Bank, and particularly the push to fiscal decentralization. This, in the World Bank's words, involves shifting some responsibilities for expenditure and or revenues to lower levels of government. So subnational entities get greater autonomy to collect taxes on the one hand and allocate expenditure on the other. So in post-reform India, as elsewhere, the increasing role of public-private partnerships at a range of levels of the state, right, from municipal, sub-federal or federal units to regional and national, has allowed for more points of access to power, capital, resources, and infrastructures at different scales, and hence more pathways to convert or conjure between scales. Thus, for instance, the idea of the world-class city links the municipal directly to both the idea of globality and to actual flows of transnational capital, much as Bollywood conjures with scaling through the post-reform coolness of the small town and the vernacular, embodied in a trope like Patna ke Presley, right, in Anurag Kashyap's 2009 Dev D. So in short, subnational entities become aspirational players in this scenario, right? They have aspirations to the global. Key to this scaling project is an institutionally backed and enforced idea of capital as essentially hypermobile and fickle. Free trade, right, rather than a national tax base hitched to centralized planning. So recall that Modi disbanded India's Planning Commission in 2014, right? Iwa Ong describes how the spate of hyperbuildings in East Asian megacities attempts to attract hypermobile global capital through what she calls the generation of promissory values about geopolitical significance, right? So you have a hyperbuilding, you are a player, right? Again, this is an economy of appearances that uses spectacle as speculation to put a place on the map so as to get capital to literally land there. And we could say the same for mega events like the Olympic Games. But if Ong is concerned with megacities in East Asian SEZs and Singh with subnational regions of Indonesia, Indian monumental statues are nodes in scalar circuits where globality is incarnated not only in national and federal projects or megacities, but also most commonly in really small towns. Politicians' electoral constituencies or new or revived pilgrimage sites, or the hometowns of self-made industrial barons. Take, for instance, the 135-foot Guru Rinpoche, or Padmasambhava, and the 100, so that's Padmasambhava, and this is the 108-foot Shiva, that face each other from two hilltops on either side of the tiny town of Namchi in the valley, which is the constituency of Pawan Chamling, Chief Minister of Sikkim since 1994. He's really hung in there. Chamling's government funded both these statues, catering to Hindu and Buddhist voters, while also bringing tourism-led development and infrastructure to the arid West Sikkim region, which is considered less scenic than other parts of the Himalayan state. And here is Pawan Chamling with a statue of a kind of local form of Shiva. Do you notice the resemblance? And in the even smaller West Sikkim town of Ravangla, a later 95-foot Sakyamuni explicitly aims at the global Buddhist pilgrimage circuit. And that was built in the constituency of local big man Didi Bhutia, who's now Minister of Power in Chamling's cabinet. Or in the south, Ravangla. And in the south, in coastal Karnataka, Bangalore-based construction and automobile baron R.N. Shetty built a big Shiva in his tiny hometown, Murudeshwar, effectively taking over the town through extensive religious and charitable patronage. So this tiny town, everything has his name on it. So this local clout gives him social, political, and economic leverage in his networks in Bangalore and elsewhere, right? So he brings people into the town, and everyone sees that he's the king, so that smooths the wheels for him. So in other words, these statues are a relatively inexpensive yet spectacular way to assert dominance and creditworthiness through boosterism and identity politics at certain scales, right? Putting towns, cities, or regions on the map in order to assert significance and to maneuver at other scales. Spectacle here becomes a means of mobility as new players in the economy seek recognition via new forms of religious patronage. As you can imagine, this form of reconfiguration of the status quo can be quite controversial, as in the case of music baron, film producer, and big Shiva builder Gulshan Kumar, who was assassinated supposedly by the Bombay underworld. All of this is made possible by the claim to globality embodied in monumental size. But here it's the circuitry between scales, the thick collaboration that's efficacious. Importantly, none of these scales, global, national, federal, municipal, cancel each other out, right? Notice, isn't it funny how you've got all these countries, but then you have Gujarat, right? So it's like inserting a different scale into the global. Indeed, Ong argues against Jameson that this kind of spectacle doesn't undermine national sovereignty, but reconfigures the space of sovereignty as, quote, emphatically and intractably global. So clearly there's no contradiction between the global and the nation reconfigured as policeman, manager, and pimp for hypermobile finance capital. Ong locates her hyperbuildings within SEZs, as what she calls zones of political exceptionality. But arguably, political exceptionality is a structural element of post-colonial and neoliberal democracies via underdevelopment on the one hand and states of terrorist emergency on the other, or in India's case, both, right? The difference is that in such situations of implicit exception, the neoliberal or post-colonial state rather than the demarcated SEZ, the space of sovereignty has to maintain a certain democratic character. That is, it has to have both the appearance and the actual affective force of an articulation with the popular. Now, in the economy of appearances, appearance and affect come to the same thing. But precisely because they come to the same thing, this economy is also subject to what William Mazzarella calls the open edge of mass publicity, the generative but radically unpredictable potential of the new. At the level of affect, then, people making projects that thrive on participation in the global can take scale-making projects in unintended, possibly contradictory or fragmentary directions, where the push for devolution accompanies a cascading implosion of subnational scales. So we see all of this at work in globality's reconfiguration of the space of democratic sovereignty as it unfolds in the Statue of Unity's play of scales. Announcing the project in 2010, in his blog, Modi called it, quote, a gift, one more from Gujarat to the nation and world on this joyous occasion. Presenting himself as gift giver on behalf of Gujarat, just as the Hindu patriarch gives ritual gifts or daan for his family's welfare, he installed himself as both Gujarat's primary representative and its patriarch. He then went on to urge his friends to watch a publicity video for the statue. In the video, Gujarat is re-signified as both metonymic with the nation and as a global entity in its own right. For it begins with an exaggeratedly staged, historical, newsreel style black and white leader and whirring projector, followed by the totally anachronistic title card, Global News, that literally projects Gujarat into a global frame from circa Indian independence in 1947, because then it goes on to show you Sardar Patel. So obviously in 1947, the word global doesn't figure at all in everyday discourse. We then see newsreel clips with a voiceover describing Sardar Patel's role in incorporating the princely states into the new nation, highlighting Kathiawar and Gujarat, Saurashtra, now in Gujarat, and note major beneficiaries of the Sardar Sarovar Dam, the site of the statue. So this direct link between subnational and global scales is underscored as we hear that Patel praised Saurashtra for presenting an example of unity to the world. Enthusiastic commentators on this video in 2011 at the website deshgujarat.com, right, a domain name that maps Gujarat onto the Desh, or nation, celebrated the way that the statue will make Gujarat global. Others lauded Sardar Patel, made over now as the Iron Man or Loh Purush, as a fitting choice for Modi's muscular political genealogy, calling Modi Chote Sardar, right? Yeah, small Sardar. Note again the language of scale. Here, Patel is implicitly being pitted against that other son of the Gujarati soil and father of the nation, Gandhi, the frail, skinny Muslim sympathizer. These competing masculinities map on to models of governance. in the project's publicity by associating Patel with good governance. Again, an anachronistic term from the developmentalist discourse of the IMF and the World Bank. Good governance is vernacularized in the Hindi and Gujarati versions of the video as Suraj, right? Good governance. Similar sounding, but quite different from Gandhi's Swaraj, or self-rule, which while also decentralized, insisted on the inseparability of cultural, political, and economic sovereignty. The soul of Swaraj was Swadeshi, or self-sufficiency, right? Quite different from global free trade. The comments on deshgujarat.com index the Statue of Unity's claim to a Gujarati globality, whose scalar affects enable Gujaratis to remake themselves within the nation via the global. But Modi's campaign for the office of Prime Minister in the 2014 national elections had to incorporate the nation into this schema. Enter an NGO called Citizens for Accountable Governance, CAG, a group of young, highly educated urban professionals whose ideas for a Statue of Unity movement included a nationwide drive to collect farming implements to be melted down for use in the statue, a Run for Unity marathon, and a Suraj petition for people to offer ideas for good governance. I know, the graphic is a little creepy. These kind of disembodied hands. So these efforts to materially incorporate the national body politic into the statue were not as successful as was hoped. Several states barely contributed to the drive for tools. What's more, it was found that the iron was too low grade for the statue and therefore would be used in some other part of the project. Well, the campaign, and of course Modi's electoral success, worked to re-signify the statue as a nationalist initiative that would put India, not just Gujarat, on the global map and justified the use of central funds for the project. It also became clear that the nation's affective investments in Modi were located elsewhere than in this rather grumpy-looking secular symbol of good governance. If his developmentalist followers were excited about infrastructure like highways, Hindu nationalists were whipping themselves into a frenzy over cows, flags, reservations, terrorists, and anti-nationals of every stripe. So the statue showed up Modi's popularity in Gujarat, which he leveraged to the national scale, but the popular appeal of the statue itself could not be scaled up in quite the same way. The statue's plastic play of scales continues in a material register, however, via the proliferation of scale models that create further circuits between global, national, and subnational levels to forge Gujarati identity and pride. In August 2015, a replica of the Statue of Unity was featured at the Glorious Gujarat USA trade show organized at the New Jersey Convention Center by the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Notice the lion logo. Modi is known as the Lion of Gujarat. And notice how it's kind of knocking the Statue of Liberty off to one side. Right? So if the Punjabi diaspora has enjoyed hegemony in Bollywood, Gujaratis have Modi and now Patel. Meanwhile, 30-foot replicas of the statue have been placed at Baben, a peri-urban village in Bardoli, where Patel was involved in civil disobedience in 1928, again, very small town, and in front of the Gujarat State Secretariat at Gandhinagar. Both of these statues were inaugurated by Gujarat's then Chief Minister, Anandiben Patel, who might have traded on their aura but for her forced resignation in August 2016, following serious challenges to the BJP government in the state. On the one hand, by Dalit unrest following a brutally violent attack on Dalits near Una by overzealous cow protectors, captured on a video that went viral. And on the other, ironically, by Gujarat's Patidar or Patel community, which claims Sardar Patel as their icon. And these are largely affluent peasants now agitating for reserved status as a backward caste. The latter then, this was an implosion of scales, where the volatile affective force of the statue's people-making aims was hijacked down to the level of caste claims rather than up to the level of national unity. So the statue's initial scale, looking outwards from Gujarat, has run into trouble both at a level up at the scale of the nation and a level down at the sub-state scale. It has also run into trouble at the level of the global. So the Statue of Unity is being built by an international multi-firm consortium following a full-page ad in the Economist news magazine in June 2011 inviting tenders, expressions of interest. Now the consortium includes US-based Turner Construction Company, which built Taipei 101 and the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, and engineering consultants, the Meinhardt Group, whose projects include the proposed Aladdin City in Dubai with 3 towers designed to look like magic lamps. Although, as we've seen, the Statue of Unity is about far more than commercial development via what Sharon Zukin has called Disneyfication, this embodies a rather more literal Disneyfication. And in another Disney connection, the project's architect is the quintessential postmodernist architect Michael Graves, designer of the 1985 Team Disney building in Burbank, California, with its famous fascia featuring the 7 dwarfs. And I don't have the slide for Rina, but he, I would say, is probably also the designer of the biggest swan. Because he did this like the Swan Resort at one of the Disney, I think the Disney complex in Florida. So while all of this unfolded within acceptable parameters of globality and passed without comment, perhaps because it involved Euro-American expertise, in October 2015 it came to light that the 25,000-odd bronze plates that would clad the statue were being manufactured not in one of India's 4,600 foundries employing 500,000 people, but obviously by, now I'm going to butcher this, Jiangxi Tongqing Metal Handicrafts Company Limited in China's Jiangxi Province Foreign Investment Industrial Zone, so another SEZ. According to a project spokesman, the contractors for the project, L&T, were, quote, free to get the material from the best possible place. However, the media were quick to seize on the contradiction between this and Modi's Make in India campaign, also with a lion logo, notice, which was launched in September 2014, soon after he came to office, which aims to, quote, transform India into a global design and manufacturing hub. Make in India hinges on massively increasing foreign direct investment, or FDI, in line with an ideology of global free trade, an aim that actually appears to have been achieved practically overnight. This is, of course, in stark contrast to Gandhi's Swadeshi vision of economic nationalism centered on not just national, but also decentralized village-level self-sufficiency. This wasn't implemented under centralized Nehruvian socialism, but was nonetheless consistent with its protectionist ethos. So again, the contrast between Make in India and Swadeshi as models of economic nationalism is consistent with the difference between their cognate governmental concepts of Suraj, or good governance, embodied in the statue, and Swaraj, or self-rule, and the modalities of scaling that these entail. Swaraj is a radically decentralized model of self-rule that scales up from individual moral self-regulation via self-sufficient villages to the scale of the nation. Suraj, or good governance, on the other hand, must negotiate the oxymoronic imperative of minimum government, maximum governance. Even as it too espouses decentralization, because this is in the service of free trade, it must also provide a stable infrastructure and orderly management of labor markets and capital flows, and do so at various scales, including that of the nation. So each of these scales must coalesce into a unit, indeed a unity, whose brand can be distinguished from others in a competitive global arena. All of this takes place in a democracy with many often competing scales of populism or people-making, as we've seen. So just to wind all this up, all of this suggests that in thinking about the cultural politics of globalization, while the focus has tended to be on the imaginaries and practices unleashed by the explosion in consumerism, it's worth also considering the retooling of nationalism via the proliferation of subnational scales and their political circuits. Here, the necessarily paradoxical and unsustainable populist rhetorics of national economic integrity return in increasingly hollowed out yet spectacular forms. And this was, this is not just true of India, this was evident in the jingoism around Brexit, or with Trump, his wall, and the chimera of a return to the industrial greatness of America. And it was also evident in Modi's overnight demonetization of 500 and 1,000 rupee banknotes as a spectacle of war against tax offenders, where the Prime Minister who dissolved India's Planning Commission was now curiously championing tax revenue as a national good, right? And the symbolism of this was particularly apposite given Modi's makeover of Gandhi and Swadeshi. For the old notes, part of the Mahatma Gandhi series, introduced in 1996 with Gandhi's face on them, have been replaced by the Mahatma Gandhi new series, right? The Gandhi makeover series. The Statue of Unity stands as a similarly fitting exemplar of India's nationhood, a nationhood made over by an uneasy détente between local populisms refracted via an idea of the global and the staging of adherence to the institutional imperatives, protocols, and discourses of global free trade. It is both the tenuous status of the nation's economic sovereignty and its participation in economic competition that necessitates such muscular, monumental declarations of identity and unity at various levels or scales of the state, alongside its spectacles of violence against anti-national others. The Statue of Unity is exemplary of these structural tensions within national yet global neoliberal regimes, in its multiscalar symbolism, in its production, and in its unpredictable uptake in the political field. No amount of global engineering expertise can compensate for these stresses and torsions in its foundations. Thank you. Yeah, let's have the lights up so everyone can wake up.
Floor is open for questions.
Yeah. I know, I just threw a lot at you, but Will.
I really enjoyed that talk a lot. It is dense, and I'm still working through parts of it. Well, two things that just sort of spring to mind. They're obvious points, and I just wonder how you work through these, given that you've given us sort of 6 processes that you laid out as interlinked and kind of important to this phenomenon. And one is the specificity of the statue's referent. I mean, does it matter that it's a Krishna or a Patel or a, and how does that figure for you in working out a kind of layered analysis of this? And the second one is the nature of the patron. The patron is a kind of celebrity in a lot of the cases, whether they're an industrialist or now the prime minister or, so those could easily kind of fall into an analysis of symbolism and whatnot, but that isn't what you're doing here much. So I just wondered if you'd talk about those two things. One is the referent of the statue itself, and the second is does it matter if we're talking about the importance of these kind of recursive interlinkages of subnational, national, and global scales, what do we do with a celebrity in that nexus? Is that pushing it? Is that required? I guess would be one way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So the question about the specificity of the referent, again, it has to do with scales, right? So the specificity has a lot to do with the very, very local significance. Well, very, very, or just very local significance of that particular figure, right? So it always comes from, so for example, any one of these statues, I mean, I've talked a lot about how the Statue of Unity has a lot to do with the Sardar Sarovar Dam, right? So Sardar Patel as a Gujarati, as not Gandhi, and how Modi needs him as his ancestor. So that's that. But, and the political ones only come after all of these religious ones are already kind of doing their job. So why the particular religious ones? Say the one in Murudeshwar in Karnataka, the one that's on the coast, right, with the beautiful backdrop of the Arabian Sea. So there's actually a Shiva temple there already. There was a Shiva temple. It was, it's a tiny, beautiful town, like village barely. And there is a particular form of Shiva. There's a very oratic lingam in the temple. So what this guy Shetty does is he first comes and renovates the temple, which is the traditional religious patronage thing to do. But that's not quite enough. And he's a construction guy. He makes, bridges and tunnels and 5-star hotels and whatever. So so then he strikes upon this idea of making a Shiva. But it's Shiva because there's a Shiva temple there, right? And then becomes king of the town. So, and similarly with what happens in Namchi, it's a particular form of Buddha. So it's not at all random. There's a very local story for each one.
But then, what would you do with something like Ranjit Kapoor's Mittal Tower in
that.
London, which is aniconic?
But that's a different, I mean,
So think of those differently.
I think differently, but not entirely differently, also because they're both kind of forms of patronage that are achieving social mobility for their patrons, right? So this is Mittal. It's called the ArcelorMittal orbit or something like that. But what's happened is that these guys, the Mitals, are these global steel baron players who are well beyond religious patronage. They want to play the big game of global artistic patronage. So, they've switched gears. And then it's about Anish Kapoor, who is, of course, the likely suspect to make a really big splash in that world, right? So in a way, it's the same thing. It's about status building via, some kind of patronage, but it's art rather than religion. Yeah. So, and about celebrity, thing is, I actually think it's the other way around. Following on from that, it's the statues that help make people celebrities, right? I mean, Modi, okay, fine, he was already a celebrity, but he's just the latest iteration. Think of a guy like Shetty, the Karnataka construction baron. He's not a celebrity. If he is at all, it's because he becomes king of this tiny place, right? Similarly, a guy like Didi Bhutia, like nobody's heard of Didi. I mean, you've probably not even heard of Pawan Chamling, frankly. He just happened to be the prime minister, the chief minister of Sikkim. But, so it's about so a guy like Didi Bhutia now becomes the big player in Ravangla, which is like 3 streets. That's the scale. But he becomes minister for power after he's shown his capability. So this is that promise, the kind of speculative aspect of statue building, right? The promise of capacity, the demonstration of capacity, right? In a completely different register. And this is the kind of weird way in which the symbolic aspects of patronage work, right? That you've just built this statue, but now you can also be minister of power. It's got nothing to do with each other, but,
Is that okay? Should I?
Please, yeah.
Thank you. That was great. It was really interesting to see from the time you set up the Gods in the Time of Democracy sort of frame to the final sort of tension between Swaraj as a self-rule and Suraj as good rule in some ways. There are 2 particular threads that I thought if you had more to say, it'd be great to hear. One is thinking about the statues as or these visualizations, these videos of created, where typically with drone photography involved, of these visualizations, as signaling the Suraj or good governance through an ability to get things done, to get things made. So just the fact that even a head like this can exist or get in the newspapers, in the local newspapers, etc., matters to that sense of Suraj. So thinking about the mediation of good governance through the visualization or the making of these statues is the ability to get done, because the standard narrative is that nothing gets done, right? And this seems to push back against that one. Right. And the other sort of thread that might be, that would be great to hear from you, would be to think about scale making, people making, yes, but also history making. A big part of, I think, setting up Sardar Patel as this this Iron Man of India, this unification icon, etc. And this is a very different register from a small Ambedkar statue in a basti, because that is literally articulating a claim to that space. This is not articulating a claim to space at all, is it? I mean, it certainly seems less so. When Mayawati's statues come up with the handbag and you've written about that, that's a very different articulation of scale and space and people making than this is. So how do you see through or work through some of those very, I mean, there's various kinds of moral entrepreneurship here and moral economies here. And I'm thinking to think about scale making in relation to those moral economies might be something that's worth thinking about.
Thank you. No, those are great questions. Well, I mean, absolutely. So this is exactly what I was trying to say about the role of the statue as a spectacle that enables speculation, right? So the ability to get things done, what you're saying, it is exactly, it's what Aiwa Ong is saying, you know, the demonstration of capacity. Exactly. It's, you know, so you can get something so spectacular done means that you can also get other things done, right? So it is literally, it's that the seeing in speculation and spectacle, right? That's the link. So that's exactly what I'm trying to show here, is that this is a kind of inexpensive way of doing that, you know. It doesn't take, it's actually not hideously, I mean, Statue of Unity, of course, that's like $500 million rupees. But these little Hanumans and such, I don't, you know, really not. So, and again, it has to do with relative size. This is why scale is always a relative thing. And that's why I think of scale as an affect, because it is about encounter, an encounter between two bodies. So the scale of the town and the scale of the statue, it's all, you know, that's kind of important, right? So if you're building a Hanuman statue in Chhindwara, which is what Kamal Nath did. So Kamal Nath was the UPA's Minister for Commerce and Industry, also infrastructure and tourism. You know, he's been many things. He's like the wealthiest politician, obviously, because he was the minister for all these things. So Kamal Nath had a Hanuman statue built in Chhindwara, tiny village in Madhya Pradesh, which is his constituency, right? So, you know, so again, it's how you work with scale to gain leverage. I mean, he didn't really need to, but so where was I going with that? Yeah, so it's, you know, the spectacle aspect has to be thought of in relation to where it's located. Therefore, if you're making claims on behalf of Gujarat and India, then you have to have a that much bigger statue, right? So it's inexpensive in a certain context, but has to then become like a much bigger project in other contexts. History making. So this is a really nice point. I mean, one of the things that I was trying to show with certainly this statue, not just history making, but history remaking, which is what the BJP has been all about, right? But that's where the claims to, and I'm very glad that you brought up the distinction that needs to be made between the Mayavati style or Ambedkar, you know, in a basti, claims to space and this kind of one. And that's why, you know, because they are different. And that's why I feel like this form, I mean, if you think back to, maybe I can go back to that image of the Tiruvalluvar statue. I mean, I think of these in terms of like a mimetic face-off between, I mean, what happens? Dalits, like the Tiruvalluvar statue, or even the smallest Ambedkar statue, the point is that it is a claim to space. That's what puts this vocabulary on the table as a kind of politically efficacious vehicle. And then Hindutva takes that up and says, okay, you want to do this, we can do it like 10 times bigger. Right? So, but having said that, so there is this mimetic aspect, but the projects are completely different. One is a minoritarian project, one is a, you know, hugely majoritarian project. And that goes to a kind of art historical point, which has to do with medium specificity and the claims that you make for a form, right? So I don't think you can necessarily speak of monuments as fascist or authoritarian, which people do with Mayavati statues, but I argue against that, right? It's not in the form itself, it's in the infrastructure of the sensible within which that form circulates. So if it's an infrastructure of the sensible where vision is all about guarding space. It's articulated with space, right? And spatiality and touch and tangibility and where you're allowed and where you're not. You have to think about that within that economy. And within that economy, there's a distinction to be made, right? So, thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, you're back on a much more pleasant image, but I wanted to know something about your last image of the, because I may have some dreams about that tonight. And I thought it was just really powerful. But I'm curious, I wanted to ask you about the kind of scale thing that you were talking about in terms of relation to the location. And I was a little surprised, I think, to hear you talk about it as the scale of the claim that's being made, right? So that the Statue of Unity is larger because it has this kind of majoritarian project. And I'm curious, it's probably because I've spent too much of my life on NH8 in those traffic jams, but it seems, I'm just curious if you would speculate a little bit about how this relates in terms of the relationships it's setting up between all those buildings and the metro and that kind of architectural unfolding.
Right. Well, actually, but just to back up for a minute, I mean, I wasn't actually saying that the Gujarat statue is large because it's majoritarian. That's not, in fact, this one is large because it's minoritarian, right? It's the DMK facing off against Vivekanand. And, so in fact, I was saying quite the opposite, which is that you can't predict, I mean, you can't just look at something large and say that it's a majoritarian thing, even though that has tended to be the case. But in this situation, it's not, right? So, I mean, that's just one thing. But in terms of the relationship with architecture and so on, I mean, absolutely, it's to do with automobility is one thing, right? The NH8, that statue is, and many of these statues are built along highways, so that partly because there's space, but also so that you can actually see them. And there's this whole kind of iconopraxis around driving by a religious image, right? People drive by and they do this, or they have, they do the whatever. And I showed that the images of the guys getting off their scooters and doing this quick little, so, and that goes with listening to bhajans on the radio, in your car. So there's a whole kind of automotive ritual sort of assemblage happening there, yeah. But it's also very striking that statue on NH8 is right across from the airport. So you can actually see it from the air as well. And I think I showed a Shiva statue in the department store. That was on the old airport road in Bangalore. So you'd be on the highway going to the airport. So it's kind of articulating with infrastructure at large, right? So I think of this as not so much articulating with architecture, but with infrastructure, I don't know if that kind of speaks to, yeah.
First, thank you for this really great and rich presentation. I was wondering on this notion of spectacle and sort of in relation to an increase in historical sites being contested, like Babri Masjid or Taj Mahal is a mandir, or even in like media presentation in the United States, like the spectacle of the Saddam Hussein statue coming down, or the spectacle of Confederate statues coming down. Is there a correlation between the erection of these statues and a similar like coming down of other statues, or almost communalist or like historical revisionist rise of things coming down? Similar. I might be rambling in that question. Sort of like this as a corresponding act of reclaiming or mythologizing history. And then as a second question, is there a corresponding rise of statue building in India by religious minorities, whether Muslims, Sikhs, or Christians, or because you pointed out a couple examples of Buddhist and Jain statues, but I'm wondering if there are statues that belong outside of that sort of like, Vedic Hindu lineage.
Right. Okay, great. I'm very glad you asked about the statues coming down question. Because there's absolutely a phenomenon that speaks to that and is part of what I was saying about the Dalit story being so important. It's not exactly bringing statues down, because statues are new, but think about Ambedkar statue desecrations, right? I'm sure you know that there's been a spate, and it was particularly intense during a certain period, but it's continuing. And interestingly, the people, the constituencies from whom the desecration comes have changed. It used to be much more upper caste, now it's more OBCs. But I think that is exactly what empowers these images. It's the desecration that then unleashes violence and protest and unites the community, right? That's what Michael Taussig calls the labor of the negative, right? It's like the power of desecration, defacement, spoilage that in fact speaks to a kind of truth about the image or reveals a public secret, right? In this case, the public secret of caste practice, right? So those energies that are unleashed can often be very violent. There could be violent protests. But that, again, feeds into politicizing the form, yeah? So that's what I think is going on here. That's why it becomes a potent political form. And then, so other minorities, of course, have jumped on the bandwagon. So, I think I showed a statue of Basava. So the Basaveshwar is a revered figure for the Lingayat community. It's a kind of offshoot of Hinduism, I guess, but, it's not quite sort of majoritarian, whatever, canonical Hinduism. There's, in Sikkim, I don't know what it is with Sikkim, but there's I don't think they've actually started the project, but there is a bid to build this kind of staircase that represents one of the indigenous peoples in Sikkim. So, again, kind of very small scale, but, big spectacle. A small constituency, but big spectacle. So everyone wants a big statue now. Right.
So you've talked suggestively about the political efficacies of these monumental statues, but I'm having a hard time envisioning that without some contextualization about the social reception and uses of these statues by different collectivities and different and varied collectivities and communities at different scales from the local on up. So I'm just wondering, and also to what degree certain statues are not only the statues, but the space around them is designed for different kinds of social uses and ends, and to what degree that is, they're designed for certain ways, but then people can, come up with other kinds of uses that are unintended as well. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit. I don't know if you can do that even generally, because you're showing so many different kinds of statues with so many different kinds of sort of, and they're framed in different ways, whether they're mythological or not, or historiographic or whatnot. And to what degree, do we have to sort of, incorporate the sort of those kinds of narratives and the social uses and all of that in order to really make sense about their
Right.
political efficacy.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked that because, I think each statue has its own story to tell. So if I'm speaking of political efficacy, I guess in some ways one can generalize about that because I think when there's a political aim, it's usually the efficacy starts even before the statue's built, via media discourse, right? And Mayawati is a good case in point because she had these building projects that I think she almost deliberately kept kind of on the boil. She would make something, change it, and everyone was just the media were getting into a frenzy about this. They were just going ballistic. And that's exactly what she wanted, right? I mean, speaking of desecration and defamation, she wanted everyone to be angry because she wanted to be getting up people's noses, which is great for her constituency, right? They could see that she was being efficacious. So it's not necessarily the actual physical presence of the statue, it's who's saying what about it. And I think similarly with the Statue of Unity. I'm sure Modi's quite happy every time someone jumps up and down and says, oh, why is China making the bronze plates or whatever, it's keeping it on the map, again, in a different way, in a different register. But the religious ones, that's a kind of very interesting thing to track. And again, there are kind of different genres at work of iconopraxis. Because these are, on the one hand, they're kind of pilgrimage sites. They may or may not be attached to a temple. So then you have to think, what's the relationship with the temple? Sometimes they, like the Shiva statues, sometimes have a lingam, sometimes they don't. Like the Birla Kanan statue doesn't have a priest. It has lingams, and it's all about you go and worship it yourself. The Karnataka statue didn't have one, but then they decided it was a good idea to have one. And then there was conflicts and tensions with the people in the main temple. So all of which is to say it's a fascinating thing to look at that question of reception and in fact I do this in the book. I have a chapter on iconopraxis where I compare 3 different sites and the different mixes of spectacle and canonical priestly religiosity. So there's this one Shiva, the one in Bangalore along the airport road, which is built behind a shopping mall. And it's just crammed with every kind of new attraction that you can imagine. So there's a wishing well, and you can write letters to God, and you write the letter and you put it in a oven. So someone's had a lot of fun imagining. In fact, I know it's the patron has had a lot of fun imagining all of these things. But you should see the comments on TripAdvisor, which is one of my ethnographic sources. People really, they don't like it because they say it's a money-grubbing exercise. It's too crowded. So that's not a very successful space. For some people it is, for some people it's not. Other places seem to get the balance a bit better. So there's a lot to be said, but it's a moving target because as I said, like in one case, there wasn't a lingam, now there is. So people are making it up as they go along. This is, yeah.
Jonathan, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand. In the back.
So you mentioned that Sikkim seems a strange place. So my question was related to that.
I didn't mean to say it's a strange.
No,
just
in this context. Now, I was wondering whether you make a distinction between statues put in popular places, or populated places, NH8, a small town, where you made your reputation, and statues on remote hilltops. I mean, you can think of the Jain statues in Karnataka, for example. You have to make a pilgrimage to
Right.
get there, right?
Yeah.
So you gave that picture of a town which is at the valley and two different hilltops having two statues. Clearly, they don't dominate the town, right? You have to actually go there to see the statues. So do you see a distinction between these two kinds of statue making that's in your face versus pilgrimage sites, if you will?
Actually, I should just clarify that those statues in Namchi, you can actually see them from the town. It's quite amazing, you know. So, you know, and one of them is golden and it flashes in the sunlight, and it does dominate. I mean, not dominate in a bad way. It's just very impressive. It's kind of beautiful. So, okay, I mean, I think the answer to that is partly, you know, each one is different, but also it's like what I was saying to Will. I think some of these statues bring people. They become pilgrimage places, even if they weren't to begin with, right? So the ones in Sikkim in particular, because it's on the tourist map, and a lot of people go to kind of North Sikkim and East Sikkim. West Sikkim, which is where Chamling is from, is supposed to be not so beautiful. But of course, if a tourist is coming from wherever and they know that there's a big statue, I mean, a lot of Bengali tourists actually in Sikkim, so Hindus who will come to a big Shiva site, you know, so it's just about like luring them slightly off their, you know, including this on their circuit. And similarly with the Muruddeshwar Shiva, it's now on the Shiva pilgrimage circuit. So it wasn't before, right? So again, the statue kind of makes it a more populated place than it was. Muruddeshwar has mushroomed, even in the time that I've been watching it, you know. So I don't think there's a hard and fast distinction to be made, that's all.
Just following up on that, I mean, I'm studying highway corridors in India, and I was fascinated by your analysis of how, you know, people commuting is also tying into kind of, you know, sort of hero worshipping of statues. I mean, so it's kind of interesting that there's a certain commercialization, industrialization that is tied into a certain scaling up of, you know, metaphysical things. The other point was regarding pilgrimage itself. I mean, I'm wondering because the highway that I'm studying is used as kind of a major pilgrimage thoroughfare, and you know, historically, it also seemed like pilgrimage was a form of primary travel. Pilgrimage sites often did, you know, come on, you know, develop on trade routes,
Right.
etc. So there seemed like a fascinating overlap of history, tradition, culture, and sort of the contemporary industrial moment itself. And I was wondering whether, I mean, obviously a lot of what you've talked about is playing with a lot of these themes. But specifically, I thought, wondering about the, you know, ways of consuming versus, you know, versus, you know, the traditional institution of a sort of religious form. What you had to, I mean, any comments on that?
Kajri, could I ask just a couple, the final question,
Mm-hmm.
Leslie, and ask you to respond to both together? That's okay.
Okay. I wondered if you'd talk a little bit more about this term Suraj that you've been using. I mean, so we're very familiar with the term Swaraj, I mean, and the very lengthy history it has in India. I mean, I guess I wondered, first of all, if Suraj has a history. I mean, it's as a concept. I mean, it's a term that I've encountered, I guess only in the 1950s, not before that. But like also whether that history is reflected at all, I mean, or has any impact at all on how that term is used today, or whether it's, I mean, sort of functioning as something onto which this very new vision of good governance is grafted.
Thank you. Actually, can I just sort of take that question first? Because you're saying Suraj was being used in the 1950s?
I've encountered it being used in the 1950s.
In what context?
Actually, in a very interesting one in relation to your paper. In the context of a section of the Indian government affiliated with the planning committee, using that term to refer to Gandhi's Khadi and Village Industries project. I mean, and so they make the argument that Swaraj is no longer the appropriate term within which to view this, rather Suraj is.
Oh, okay. I didn't know this history. Thank you.
I can give you a reference.
I'd love to, yeah.
Yeah, no,
That's
no, I have a
fantastic,
PDF
yeah,
actually of
yeah.
the source.
No, I assumed actually, I should have looked into the history, but I kind of assumed that it was a recent literal translation of good governance.
No,
So that's
absolutely.
super interesting. Thank you.
Maybe you found that in the trousseau of the now defunct planning.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's right. But to come back to your thing, your questions about the metaphysical and the commercial and the traditional. I mean, I think this is one of the things that I've been trying to do in my work, even in the previous book, is to disabuse us of this idea that we can think religion and commerce in some separate way. And this goes back to the problems with the very notion of religion as we've received it and its colonial kind of genealogy that means that it's very loaded with this Christian baggage. And in particular, I mean, not just Christian, but a kind of Protestant baggage, where there's a separation between the material and the spiritual, between, and there's these terms that are used, like faith. And, like, why is a religion a faith if actually, faith per se is actually quite specific to certain religious traditions? Or confessions. I mean, religions are called confessions. Like, why? Not all religions have anyway, so that's a kind of soapbox of mine. But the fact is that we've gotten into the habit of making this distinction, whereas a lot of practices, and that's why my first book is called Gods in the Bazaar, because in the kind of vernacular ethos of the bazaar, traders and small manufacturers and so on, the people who make these calendars with gods on them and circulate them to their customers and to their business associates, they're not thinking that there's anything weird about that. And you get that actually in Latin American Catholicism as well, right? So this is, I mean, it's something that we have to kind of rethink. And this is, again, one of the sort of soapboxes of the book. People often think of these new religious forms as somehow secularized. I don't think that makes any sense, because they're Shivas and Buddhas. What is secular? People pray to them. But they think they're secularized because they're so entangled with commerce, right? So I think this is a big, paradigm shift that we have to make in understanding, our contemporary scenario, right?
Please join me in thanking Kajri for a fantastic talk.